Hi and welcome back to ScottiesTech.Info. I'm Scotty with my co-host Cletus. So this video is about which is better for your privacy, iOS or Android. Now you're probably thinking, hang on a minute, Scotty, aren't you the whole like dumb phones and KaiOS and Lineage OS guy? Yes, that was me. The dumb phones kind of didn't work out. I have a smartphone now. It's an Android phone. It's a Xiaomi 11 Lite 5G, something like that. I don't actually have 5G in the area. I turned the 5G off. It's only mid-band 5G anyway. But the thing is that I had a dumb phone for a while and it kind of didn't really cut it for me. I needed some smartphone functionality on the rare occasions when I do. I was out, needed smartphone type stuff. But the big problem was that smartphones are needed for pretty much everything these days. I wrote an article called Two-Factor Authentication Without SMS or a Smartphone. And in that article, there are some nice comments at the bottom. but and in that article, I explained that you don't really need to have a smartphone. If you just borrow a phone from a friend or something, you can get an SMS, you set up Authy, and boom, you have two-factor authentication. Well, that's not even really true anymore because as I discovered with my own bank here in France, I couldn't actually do any banking without installing the bank's app on my smartphone, and that meant I had to have either an Android or an iOS app. Then, of course, there's KaiOS. No, there's no bank app for KaiOS. And as far as Lineage OS goes, I tried it for a while. The problem I had with it was that, at least in my specific area, whatever they do with the radios, the actual cellular network connection coding, or whatever they do with the hardware, it meant that I would sometimes not receive SMSs at all, and very often, in fact, about 60% of the time, I would try to make a phone call, say to my wife, and the connection would just cut out. And she would try to call back, and I would try to call her, and it just didn't work most of the time. Now, that's a common problem with Lineage OS and other sort of more kind of third-party flavors of Android. Is in some cases they work very, very well. In others, they don't. And unfortunately, I don't know exactly what the problem was, but I just went, you know what? I'll just get like a regular, commercial Android phone. And so anyway, I picked this Xiaomi phone, and it's great. I love it. I use it occasionally. Obviously, the first thing I did when I got it is I went through and I turned off, I checked all the privacy stuff. I checked the security stuff. I try not to use Google, but that's kind of impossible. If you want to download any app, you need to put your Google login in so that you can access the Play Store. And of course, I needed the Play Store because you can't get the bank's app without the Play Store. So, right, here I am stuck with an Android smartphone because I kind of have no choice if I want to live in the world. But anyway, so that's the story of how I ended up with a real, honest-to-God, Google-powered Android smartphone. Then, as many of you know, back in early June, I got married. Yay! And at the wedding, I had my first real encounter with an iPhone. So what happened was a good friend of mine came to me and said, Scotty, I took a couple of photos and I need you to, get them off and put them on your computer and send them to somebody. It's kind of a long story. So fortunately, he had the Lightning to USB cable. So, I took his iPhone, I plugged it in, stuck it into my Windows 11 desktop computer. And of course, a prompt came up on the iPhone and it said, oh, this computer wants to connect, and I was like, yeah, transfer files. And poof, it worked. I had heard you need to install iTunes if you want to share or sync any data and blah, blah, blah. No, it was like just very straightforward. The really cool thing was that this friend of mine came back a second time and said, hey, can you do this again? And the second time when I plugged it in, I didn't get the prompt. It just worked. And the memory of the iPhone appeared in File Explorer in Windows 11, and I was like, oh, there's the Photos folder. There you go. I copied it over. Now I compared this to my Android phone, where every single time I connect my phone, I take my phone, I snap some photos, right? I want to transfer those photos to my computer. I take the USB cable, I plug it in, I plug it into my computer, and a little notification in Android pops up. And of course, it doesn't stay there long enough, so I have to swipe down, and then I have to tap the USB notification, and then I get three options, access photos, you know, transfer files, or charge only or something, and I have to tap transfer files, and then finally it comes up in Explorer. And I have to do this every single time I connect my Android smartphone to the computer. So this was kind of my first ever experience with iPhone where I kind of went like, well, geez, they made that a lot easier. You know, that was kind of nice. But of course, you know, that's not enough to make me get an iDevice, right? I mean, they're kind of expensive, and I don't know. So, right. Then it turns out that I have a great aunt who is great, and unfortunately she could not come to the wedding, and so I said, well, let's do a Zoom, and she has an iPhone and an iPad, and it was like, well, geez, you know, I'm the techie here. I should probably make it easier for her because she's not really a techie. So I sent her an email and I said, hey, you know, instead of just doing this Zoom thing, which she had problems with when trying to watch the live stream of our wedding, I was like, all right, look, let me just make it easier. So I asked her, like, what do you use if you do like video chats with the family, right? She said FaceTime. And I went, oh dear, I don't own any iDevices. So I asked a friend of mine who had like a second generation iPad Air if I could borrow it. So I grabbed it, you know, I dusted off my old Apple ID from the old days when I used to have iTunes like ages ago. And I put, you know, I logged into this friend's iPad Air. And of course, you know, we did FaceTime, and you know, in trying to set it up, you know, I didn't know how to use the dang thing. And I thought, well, geez, if I was Apple, what would I do? Well, I would enter, you know, my aunt's, you know, email address in the contacts, and then, you know, I still couldn't click the FaceTime button, the video button. So I thought, well, I know, I'll tell her to add me as a contact. So she did, and suddenly, poof, I get the camera icon, and I just tapped it, and boom, we were connected. It was just really, really easy. The quality was good. It was almost effortless to set it up, even though I had no idea what I was doing. Okay, let me back up a second, because then what happened was I have a Galaxy Tab S6. It's a very nice tablet. It has the S Pen, and it has the nice keyboard cover, and whenever I, like for example, if I travel or if I'm trying to debug some network problem, instead of hauling around my big 17-inch heavy gaming laptop, I just use this little Tab S6 with the keyboard cover, and I have a little wireless mouse for it if I need to. So it's kind of like a little tablet, and that's pretty much what I use it for. Now, as I mentioned, it has an S Pen, and my wife was wanting to use the Nebo app, which is kind of a note-taking thing. You can draw boxes and do diagrams, and she's a translator and a linguist and is working on various projects, and she's like, you know, this Nebo app would be really handy. So I thought, maybe what I'll do is, since I need FaceTime, maybe what I'll do is I'll just get myself an iPad, and I'll give her my Galaxy Tab S6 tablet, and she'll have the pen, she'll have the keyboard, you know, she'll have her own little thing. So that's what I did. And so now she's very happy with Nebo. And I got a new iPad Air with a Logitech keyboard cover, the Apple Pen, the whole 9 yards, right? So then when we went on a trip recently, we both had our little miniature computers, and we were very happy. So I got to take the iPad for kind of a test drive. Now, when I first got it, I didn't really know anything about privacy. I mean, I know how to sort of not really secure Android and make it private, because that's not really possible, but I knew the basic stuff you do just to minimize the data that's being hoovered up by Google, right? But I didn't really know for iOS. Now, okay, going forward, I'm going to refer to iOS. I know that there's iPad OS and iOS, but for all intents and purposes, let's just call it all iOS to keep things simple. So when I first got the new iPad Air, I was setting it up, and I had my friend's old iPad, which I thought I had turned off. And what happened was, when I was doing the setup on the new iPad, suddenly the old iPad woke up, and it said, oh, I've detected your old iPad. Would you like to connect to it? And I'm going like, wait, I thought I turned this thing off. Now, some of you may remember my earlier video, off isn't really off. Yeah, that was the case with these iPads. So anyway, I transferred all the data over. It found my account. It found, you know, blah, blah, blah. Everything was glorious. But at that point, I realized, okay, I really need to learn how this iPad OS or iOS is working, and I need to figure out what was going on. And it turns out that what was going on is you have things like AirDrop and Bluetooth and Wi-Fi, which even when you tell it to shut down, the iPad doesn't really shut down. It keeps some of those radios active so that if, say, you want to transfer files or set up a new device or whatever, it will wake up from being asleep, so it's not really off. And I kind of discovered this the hard way because it had been shut down for several days, and when I turned it back on, the battery was like almost empty, and I went, okay, so eventually I figured out that what you need to do if you have an iPad and you want to turn it off, is you first need to put it in airplane mode. That means no AirDrop, no Bluetooth, no Wi-Fi, no wake me up if blah, blah, blah. Turn all that stuff off and then go to settings, shut down. Then your iPad will actually be off. And I proved this by not using it for a week and then powering it on, and my battery life was still at exactly 64%. Now, all of that is to explain that then I realized I really needed to dig into privacy settings on iOS, because obviously if I thought it was off but it wasn't, I turned off things like iCloud because I don't need to sync everything into the cloud, kind of like Google Drive and contact syncs, and So I decided I really needed to take a closer look at iOS and its privacy features, and I kind of wanted to figure out, okay, well, the general consensus is that iOS devices, iPad OS devices, are more privacy friendly than Android, but is this actually true? So that's what I endeavored to find out. Now, I have to note here that when I say privacy friendly, I'm talking about like everyday normal user level privacy. Many of you have probably heard of the Pegasus spyware. It's actually a suite of malware tools. Pegasus has been, it's made by an Israeli company, and they try to sell it to like government agencies, governments, police stations around the world. Like I think like the police in like San Francisco or something wanted to buy it, but it was too expensive. And what Pegasus is it's a suite of malware that lets organizations basically target a particular smartphone, whether it's iOS or Android, and usually without the user even doing anything. Even on iPhones, they can actually load this malware wirelessly without you doing anything, and it completely compromises your whole phone. Like, they have all the data. They can listen to the microphone, they can turn on the camera, they can view your contacts, see your web browsing, they get all the data on the phone. It's really, really nasty. So when I'm talking about privacy, I'm not talking about Pegasus level. I'm talking about like, you're just an ordinary Joe and you don't want Google or Apple or anybody like seeing everything you're doing. If you're using Google Maps, and they don't need to track your location everywhere you go, and listen in when you're saying like, I would like a beer, and suddenly you see beer ads everywhere, like that kind of thing. I'm talking about normal user privacy. Which one is better, iOS or Android? So I decided to look into it, and okay, so first of all, Android. Well, just as a quick summary, Android is basically found on cheaper smartphones, and very often they have rather performant processors inside. They're the same or sometimes even faster performance than iPhones. But the lower cost of Android devices is due to data mining. So, an iPhone might cost 2 or 3 times more than an Android phone, and the reason they can do that is because you're accepting Google services. And when you accept Google services, you're basically paying for the other half or 2/3 of the phone by the fact that your data is being hoovered up and sold or used to sell you things, or for marketing purposes, for sales purposes, and that's how the rest of the phone is being paid for. For Android, of course, we have the Google Play Store. That's where you get all the apps from. You have to sign in with a Google account. As I mentioned, to get, like, say, an official bank app, it must come from the Play Store, which means you must sign in with your Google account, which means, right, they're tracking everything you do. The big thing for Android is everyone says, well, it's open source. Now, that's true that the core Android operating system was open sourced by Google, but there's all kinds of proprietary code, like the Play Store code and all the other stuff that Google adds on top of it, that is not open source, that is proprietary. And even when we're talking about the core Android operating system, open source doesn't necessarily mean more secure. I can hear many of you like cringing and throwing your screen across the room or your phone or whatever device you're watching this on, because you're probably big fans of open source software, as many people are. But the reality is actually quite simple here. If I write a chunk of code and I put it out there and it's open source, anyone can see the source code. Now, if various programmers and coders look at that source code and they find security flaws, and they actually report those security flaws to the proper channels. And the proper channels then forward it to the development teams and the people who are actually improving the open source software. And if those people actually patch the holes, and if they release patches to secure those holes, and if the people running the open source Android, if their phones actually get updates, and if they actually install them, then open source is more secure. But there's a lot of ands there. There's a lot of steps that need to happen, and it actually very often doesn't happen, because one of the problems with Android phones is that, say I have a Xiaomi phone, their actual interface is called MIUI. Currently it's MIUI 13. What that means is that they take the core Android operating system and they put kind of their own wrapper on everything, which means I can't actually get the latest version of Android until Xiaomi or Samsung or whoever manufactures the phone actually takes the new version of Android and updates all their stuff, their wrapper, plop it on top of the new version of Android, make sure everything works, and then release it to me. Which means Android phones are very often not updated, sometimes not at all, as compared to iPhones, which are updated fairly frequently because they have a single code base and everything is much simpler. So that's kind of a problem with Android. You know, everyone thinks that open source means better. Not necessarily. It really depends on the details. The final note about Android is that it is more widely used. It turns out that 60% of smartphone users in the US have iPhones. Only 40% of Americans have an Android-based phone. Now, the rest of the world is very different. Now, keep in mind here that the population of the US is, whatever, 360, 70 million people. The population of the whole rest of the earth is like 7.8 billion or more. Like, it's a lot more people, right? Well, only 40% of Americans use Android, but 75% of the rest of the world uses Android, not iPhone. So what that means is that the vast majority of the population of planet Earth are using various Android phones, and that means that that operating system, Android, is kind of going to be a bigger a target for more attacks, and most likely more hackers will expend their time and energy to hack Android than they will iOS, which kind of works against Android. Now, as for iOS, generally speaking, Apple does way less profiling of users. I'll give an example of that in a minute. On the other hand, the phones are usually more expensive, as I mentioned, sometimes 2 or 3 times more expensive. So basically what happens with Apple is they have kind of their own closed ecosystem. They have tight integration between hardware and software. And as I've noted, a couple of my experiences, I was like, wow, that's pretty good. You know, it's very handy. There are a few drawbacks to that. Things are not quite as hackable, modifiable, if you will. Hackable not in the sense of like malware, evil people doing things, but like I'm a techie, I want to, you know, customize the software to do something. That's more possible on Android than it is on iOS. Essentially with iPhones, what you're doing is you're paying more money up front for increased privacy, because they don't have to hoover up all this data about you and use it and sell it and make money that way, because you've already just paid them up front. So yeah, you are kind of paying too much for the devices, for what you're getting, but it's kind of like cheap phone with more privacy violation or expensive phone with less privacy violation. Also, iOS has things like end-to-end encryption of iMessage and FaceTime chats. This is kind of like a no-brainer. Now, speaking of encryption, a few years ago there was a story where the US, the FBI, arrested some dude who was like a terrorist or something. I don't remember all the details, but he had an iPhone, and they wanted to unlock his iPhone, and he said, no, I won't do it. So the FBI approached Apple and said, you know, basically crack this guy's phone for us, and Apple said, no, we're not going to do it. And in fact, what the FBI eventually ended up doing is they went to an Israeli company, and the Israeli company hacked the phone for them, and that's how they got in and got all the guy's data. But I remember reading about that and going, you know, wow, I was a little bit surprised that, you know, Apple didn't sort of, you know, capitulate and, you know, cave and say like, oh, okay, you're the FBI, here you go. They were like, no, our users' privacy is, you know, it's sacrosanct, it's holy, we're not going to, you know, violate. Of course, that was a wonderful marketing opportunity as well. But it does say something about the privacy of, you know, Apple stuff, so that's not too shabby. Apple, of course, has its own app store like the Google Play Store. Generally speaking, the apps are viewed as pretty high quality. it's a bit safer, I would say, because Apple is far more strict about what apps get put on their store. Some would say too strict, but that's a story for another time. Apple's OSs are, of course, closed source, and previously I was talking about the whole open source thing. There are benefits and drawbacks to open source versus closed source, for sure. But with closed source, yeah, it doesn't mean that exploits won't be found, because of course they will. Every operating system has exploits, but kind of like out of the gate, that's a little bit better for general user security and privacy. Also, Apple is able to provide faster and more consistent updates. For example, if you have an Android phone, you might have the Google Play Store, and then you have, say, if you have a Samsung device, it has the Galaxy Store on top of it. So you have two different sources for updates, and one is the integrated Samsung apps, and of course they're all probably spying on you too. Blah, blah, blah. It's all very complicated. You need to remember to update both, and it's kind of crazy. And with Apple, it seems that they just have this one source of updates, and whenever there are security holes, they generally update them and get them pushed out to all users rather quickly and seamlessly. It just sort of happens and you're done, and you don't really have to think about it, which is kind of nice. Also, devices get updates for much longer, generally speaking, on iOS. For example, there was the iPhone 6S from 2015. This was like a 6-7-year-old device. It actually got the update to iOS 15. Now, that's pretty much unheard of in the Android world. After 2 or 3 years, you're lucky if you get any OS updates, which means you're not getting security updates, which means you have holes in your operating system, which is not cool. And finally, with iOS, there's been this whole hullabaloo recently involving Facebook and Google, and Apple has done this whole push to reveal the various apps on their app store, like what permissions are those apps actually requesting of your iPhone. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but they also added, in iOS 14, they added this thing called the App Privacy Report, which is pretty snazzy because basically you can go in and you can say, okay, this app right here, when was the last time that it accessed the internet? How much data did it send? You can even see like the domain names, the websites that it actually sent data to. It's pretty thorough and pretty nifty, and it in addition to some other measures that they added, they're very big now on kind of showing the end user what's going on with their privacy, whereas before it would, they kind of didn't bother the end user with it, and people didn't like that, of course. So that's also pretty nice. Now, a couple interesting notes. Even if you have an iOS device, you have to be careful about certain things. For example, usually iCloud is enabled by default. They want you to sync all your data, your photos, your videos, even the apps that you use. So they have this whole app sync thing where if you have multiple devices and you install an app on one device, the app sort of gets synced to the iCloud, and that app will be automatically installed on your other Apple devices. I read about one exploit where basically if the person could hack your iCloud account, they could sort of add apps to all your devices. And of course, if it's a malicious app, that's not good. I don't know how widespread that is. Probably not very widespread, but the point is if you don't need all your data synced to the cloud, turn it off, especially the whole app sync thing. Because, I certainly don't need that. If I need an app on 2 devices, I can just manually click the button and install it. It's no big deal. Also, you have to choose apps on either iOS or Android very, very carefully. There was a study done, and they found that 89% of apps on Android had at least one tracking mechanism in them, and 79% of apps on iOS had at least one tracking gizmo built in. That's actually not terribly surprising, but so apps on one platform versus the other, they're all kind of tracking you, so you have to be aware of that. The interesting thing is which countries that these trackers are based in. It turns out that 83% of iOS trackers are based in the United States. 93% of Android trackers are in the USA. Now, you may recall that I mentioned that in the US, 60% of smartphone users are iPhones, right? And in the rest of the world, 75% of smartphones are Android. And yet all the tracking that all these phones are doing, especially Android, 93% of the sort of tracking companies are in the United States, not outside the United States. So here we kind of understand maybe a little reason why the EU is kind of pushing for increased privacy laws, amid other kind of ridiculous reasons. But It's kind of interesting to note that one. Even more interesting is the fact that the number 2 and number 3 tracking countries are China and India, but here we are talking about single-digit percents, like between 2 and 5% in China. But as I said, 83% of iOS based in the USA, 93% of Android trackers based in the USA. So the next time you're worried about like China spying on you, don't be, because it's actually the United States of America that's hoovering up all your data. Next, speaking of apps, if you use dedicated apps like Facebook, be very, very careful. You can go in the web browser, you can log into Facebook, you can use everything that way. That is actually a much safer option than installing like the dedicated Facebook app or WhatsApp or whatever, because the minute you do, if you look at the permissions that those apps want, they want access to everything. The compass, the magnetometer, the position, everything. Your contacts, videos, photos, can I make phone calls, can I send SMSs, can I read all your SMSs, can I just do everything? Yes, of course you can, because I want to chat with my friends. The minute you do that, like, you are basically just giving them all kinds of data, and the same is true even on iOS. For example, on iOS, the minute you install a Google app, you're pretty much screwed in terms of privacy. Here we see a little graphic about if you use the integrated Apple Mail app on iOS, the data linked to you, contact info, and identifiers that consist of basically a user ID. And then on the other hand, we have the Google Gmail app, data linked to you, purchases, contact info, user content, identifiers, diagnostics, location, contact, search history, usage data, and other data. My favorite is other data because that could include pretty much anything. But if you actually dig down into this, what you actually see is that it's a lot worse than it looks on Google's side, because Apple Mail data linked to you. Again, contact info, identifiers, it's email address, name, user ID. Not so bad, right? The Google Gmail app has like everything: course location, user ID, advertising data. For analytics, it's your purchase history, your course location, your email address, like the list of data goes on and on. Product personalization, app functionality. If you install the Gmail app and use it to send mail, they're literally taking like all the data they can possibly get about you and sending it off to Google servers and probably anybody who will pay for it. So yeah, that was a little bit eye-opening. This all came about as a result of Apple's App Store requiring Google Apps to reveal how much data they were sucking up. And of course, everyone was a tad shocked. So yeah, in the end, it kind of seems like Apple is doing a much better job with iOS and iPadOS in terms of privacy. As I said, yeah, if you install a Google app on your iPhone, you can say goodbye to privacy, but you don't need to do that. There are various alternatives, and yeah, overall, I have to say that when it comes time for me to replace my smartphone, I'm probably going to think very seriously about getting an iPhone instead. I can't believe I just said that, but I may go broke trying to actually get one, but yeah, it does look like out of the box, iOS is more secure, more privacy safe than Android. And if you customize everything, it's even more privacy friendly, far more than Android is if you customize Android. So yeah, I thought that was pretty interesting. But let me know in the comments below, have you used both Android and iOS? What do you think about the whole privacy thing? Have you found one to be more private or secure than the other? I'm actually interested to hear other people's stories, because as I said, I haven't actually gotten an iPhone yet, and right, maybe you know something I don't. So let me know in the comments below. For more techie tips, see ScottiesTech.Info. Thanks for watching. See you next time.